but let me nonetheless very shortly introduce Dan Carpenter. Is a professor of government at Harvard University and contributed to the field of regulation and governance massively and durably. Among an impressive body of work, I would like to just mention very selectively a couple of his influential classic publications, so to say, namely his book, The Forging of Bureaucratic Autonomy, on the historical emergence, development, and empowerment of autonomous agencies in the US. The book, Preventing Regulatory Capture, outlining how to conceptualize, detect, and try to avoid regulatory capture. And his book, Reputation and Power, Organizational Image and the Pharmaceutical Regulation of the FDA, where he examines the dynamics of pharmaceutical regulation and lobbying with his seminal reputational approach to regulation and governance. So I think I will stay with that. So thank you very much again for accepting our invitation for your talk on credible products depend on credible regulations, lesson from therapeutic development in the COVID crisis. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna start here. I want to thank David and Martino for this generous introduction and invitation. And I sincerely hope everybody is well. It's a very, we're speaking academically about COVID-19, but I'm sure many of you know of people who have had it or have passed away from it. My wife's own godmother just passed away from it about a month ago. That godmother's daughter just passed away from it. So we're living in the midst of these very human times. And I look forward to the chance when I can see everybody here in person, whether that's in Europe or Jerusalem or wherever. I want to begin, and I want to acknowledge as well the support that the network in regulation and governance and a number of people in the audience have given my own work. In fact, I'm going to draw on one of my early papers in the journal Regulation and Governance for today's paper. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't use this opportunity shamelessly to promote something that really doesn't have too much to do with regulation and governance, but is my next book. It doesn't have much to do with contemporary regulation and governance. It has a lot to do with historical regulation and governance. This is a book coming out in 3 months, and it's about the role that petitioning played in democratization in North America, the United States, Canada, parts of British West Indies, many indigenous nations, and parts of Mexico. Something I've been working on for a long time, kind of points to an alternative model of democratization. I'm not going to talk further, but please excuse the shameless plug. Check it out. Again, it's pretty old school, deals with stuff 150 years ago or more. So as a roadmap for today, I want to talk about the following things. First, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what happened this summer. Well, 2 things happened this summer. Well, a lot happened this summer. But 2 things that I want to talk about are, first, what I want to talk about is a non-credible regulatory performance by a pretty important government regulator, as many of you know, that I've studied and many of you have studied, the FDA. And then I want to talk about what we can barely observe in the data. And I think, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go back and get a really granular, tight kind of quasi-experiment. But what I regard as a rather troubling response on the part of the American public in at least 2 opinion polls where the credibility of the FDA was doubted. I want to then think about some theoretical approaches that others, including previous presenters in this fantastic series, have used. And then I want to basically use this as an example to think about, well, can we view this moment, not just COVID, but the moment that happened when the FDA gave a non-credible regulatory performance in August as a way of getting an estimate, getting a peek at the value of credible regulation in crisis. And then finally, I want to talk about the implications of this whole story for approval regulation institutions. That's a particular form of regulation that I've described, again, including in the Journal of Regulation and Governance, and then for regulatory evaluation, so-called regulatory impact analysis and RIA. So what happened this past year? Well, a lot. And again, I wish you all well. But here's one of the things that happened. So on August 23rd, just on the eve, or I believe it was, yes, the eve and the ending of the Republican National Convention, the Food and Drug Administration issued an emergency use authorization, that's not a full approval, for a convalescent plasma as a COVID-19 treatment. And they did so in a way that was different in a bunch of respects. First, potential promising COVID-19 treatment, another achievement in administration's fight against pandemic. These kinds of qualifiers and words do not commonly appear coupled with FDA authorizations. The idea that the FDA authorization would have something to do with the president itself, given the historical insulation of the FDA from the political branches, not perfect insulation, but especially the presidency, I'd be willing to claim, also not customary. And then, and I'm not going to replay it for you here, it was kind of an overweening, kind of capitulative appearance by the FDA Commissioner, Stephen Hahn, where the authorization was announced at the White House in a press conference. Again, sometimes the FDA Commissioner will be on a conference call. Usually the FDA Commissioner has nothing to do with a press conference announcing the approval of something. Never has an authorization or a drug approval occurred when the FDA Commissioner actually appeared on stage with the president and then thanking the president and then overclaiming the benefits of what had happened. He confused absolute and relative risk. You can look this up online, things like that. And then he had to backtrack. So one day, notice that the FDA news release is the 23rd. The next day on the 24th, Hahn has to tweet out and says, look, this is not a final approval. We don't yet know whether this works. We have some early promising evidence. I've been criticized for remarks I made at that press conference on the benefits. The criticism is justified. I mentioned absolute risk reduction, but in fact, it's relative risk reduction, big difference. And as Post, which report said, this was not the first time that the FDA to capitulate to the pressure of President Trump to approve something. 2 months ago, they had approved this drug called hydroxychloroquine, also giving it emergency use authorization, but then had to revoke it after the data came back pretty unconvincing. And then here's the important read that the Post gives it, but many Americans were giving it. Given that Trump had pushed for the drug, that is hydroxychloroquine, and then bragged about speeding the initial authorization process along, it raised very valid concerns about whether the FDA had made a hasty decision under political pressure. Those concerns have to rise after the spectacle we saw Sunday, and indeed they did. So here's the pink sheet for those of you who study the FDA. This has long been, for about 60, 70 years, the main trade journal covering. Sarah Carlin Smith, a very accomplished journalist for that, says FDA Commissioner Hahn's credibility is in question following an emergency use authorization for convalescent plasma. Hahn's actions combined with President Trump's attack on FDA staff as being deep state actors, that happened in a tweet, may compromise, and this is key, the public trust in the agency's work during COVID-19 and beyond, former officials say. So the question here is not so much whether people doubted convalescent plasma, because you're only going to get that under the authorization of a doctor once you're pretty sick already. But of course, there were vaccines in the pipeline. And it got worse. In the following days, there was an FDA spokesperson named Emily Miller with zero scientific expertise who had been appointed by the Trump administration. She was fired. Hahn quickly had to backtrack. To be quite frank, I myself contributed to the momentary loss of the FDA's reputation. I gave an interview to the New York Times, which they tweeted out some of the things. And I said, look, I thought this was a low moment for the FDA in at least a generation. This kind of, there's always been politics at the FDA, but it can often be methodological politics of a scientific sort. It can often be disease politics, one claimant against another. But this was really a deep injection of electoral and campaign politics into the FDA. And that really was, I don't want to say unprecedented. It has happened before, but to this degree, really not in a generation. And so the FDA took a reputational hit. So that's number one, what happened this summer. The second, and I think related, was a dip in confidence in vaccines as expressed in American opinion polls. It was notable. It happened at a very given time, and it happened in selected populations, which is going to be very important for the modeling exercise I'm going to engage in. And it did not occur with other indicators of COVID-19 attitudes or behavioral responses. So here's a Gallup panel of what happens between July and October. And it says, if an FDA, and notice the question wording, which I think is helpful for our purposes. If an FDA-approved vaccine to prevent coronavirus COVID-19 was available right now at no cost, would you agree to be vaccinated? So you're taking cost out of the equation in this question design. And you can see it's the approval or the willingness to take is bouncing around 60%. Right until August 30th. And notice, by the way, that last panel wave is being conducted basically at, but really kind of after or before the event. 2 weeks later, there's a 10 percentage point drop in the willingness to take or agree to be vaccinated, and a corresponding 11 percentage point rise in an unwillingness to be vaccinated, most of which disappears a month later, right? So cause and effect is, as we know, almost impossible to establish with observational data. I'm not even going to claim that we're able to claim it here. I'm going to go back and try to get the marginals from this poll and some of the data. But it seems like something was going on. There was maybe a small downward trend, but again, this was a dip, and the confidence in the vaccine bounced back a month later. And notice it was concentrated among the very sorts of people who would have been most likely to have taken the vaccine in the first place. That is progressives, liberals, people who are more likely to believe in science, otherwise known in the United States as Democrats. Sorry for the joke. And so if you look here, the confidence of Democrats in the vaccine was again hopping along at 80%. Then drops 25 percentage points in 2 weeks, right? After that, those late August things, then bounces back, and I don't have the latest here, but bounces back another 15%. So something happened in late August, early September to induce these numbers. And again, we already know of significant vaccine hesitancy in the United States, but this drop was occurring among people who I would argue were probably least likely to be guided by pre-existing vaccine hesitancy, as you can see, right, in the pre-trends, in the 80% or more who would have been willing to take it in July and August. Now, if we go into another poll, and oh no, this is in the Gallup poll. And we asked why people wanted to, were concerned about it. And they said, what's your main reason if you were going to say no? The main reason was concerns about a rush timeline, right? That's 37%. Only 12% said, I don't trust vaccines generally. Equally divided among men and women. If you go down what is highlighted here, notice 18 to 44-year-olds, they predominantly, almost half of them who don't want to get the vaccine are concerned about the rush timeline, pretty much dwarfing any other reason that would exist. Again, Democrats, more than half of Democrats who don't want to get the vaccine as of this October 19th, November 1st panel wave, are concerned about the rush timeline. And so these are the kinds of concerns. So generally you have younger people, more progressive people. These are people who are concerned about the Trump effect on the FDA. Not a huge correlation with education, although a modest one, things like that. But notice that among those who are educated for college degrees, especially, 41% and 36% respectively say their concerns about rush timeline and safety concerns are more important than lack of trust in vaccines for not wanting to take it. There was another poll taken by the Kaiser Family Foundation. And here, what you can see is it's kind of rough. So we have a wave that we observe in September 2020, and a wave that we observe in either October 2020 or December 2020. Notice, by the way, that from September 2020, if you go to the top there, to October 2020 to December 2020, there is pretty much no movement in the aggregate percentage of people in the United States who say wearing a mask helps spread the limit of coronavirus, or wearing a mask is harmful to your health, right? There is, however, an 8 percentage point shift, question 16, on whether a coronavirus vaccine that would have been approved whether people would take it. And you see that there in the bottom. And again, now keep in mind that by September 2020, we're already past what is probably the peak of the effect that we saw in the Gallup poll. But I put this out there basically to say that, okay, here's more evidence from another poll, not quite the same panel structure that we might like, of a loss in confidence in the COVID-19 vaccine, or anyone that might be forthcoming as of September, something that again dissipates later, and that other sort of indicators of vaccine hesitancy are not moving. Furthermore, please tell me if of the following is a major reason, minor reason, or not, if you would or would not want to get a COVID vaccine. Well, do you not trust vaccines in general? Might be, that's part of it. 37% list that as a major reason. You don't think you're at risk of getting sick from COVID, 20%. Risks of COVID-19 are being exaggerated. Again, 43%. But then there's G, and among all of the major reasons, this is number 2, along with possible side effects. You do not trust the government to make sure the vaccine is safe and effective. For those of you who follow the FDA, that is the literal language in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, as amended, that the FDA must use those criteria to approve new drugs. So meaningful there. And then finally, how confident are you that when a coronavirus vaccine becomes available, it will have been properly tested for safety and effectiveness? Again, remember, there's no movement in things like, I think COVID is a hoax. I mean, there's a certain number of people who believe that, but there's no movement between September and December. But there's a 15 percentage point increase between September and December. Now, a lot more is happening there in a group of people who believe that the vaccine will have been properly tested. So how to think about this 5, 10%, 10, 15 percentage point decline in confidence in expressed willingness to take a COVID vaccine as a result of what was perceived to be heavy political pressure by the President of the United States facing a tight re-election campaign in a polarized environment on the regulatory institution. Well, I want to sort of think about 3 theoretical mechanisms in general. One, we can think about institutions and trust in the same way that Professor Margaret Levy did a few weeks ago in this seminar. Second, we can think about vaccine hesitancy, as Professor Verhulst and his colleagues did in an earlier TiGRE seminar. And we can also think about the credibility of regulation. I'm going to walk through these pretty quickly. So this is from a previous TiGRE presenter, speaker Margaret Levy. We can think about compliance, see that on the bottom, behavioral-based legitimacy, which is one way to think about the willingness of people to take a vaccine, right, as being shaped by things way upstream: administrative competence, government effectiveness, government performance. That is definitely one possibility. So I want to suggest that consistent with Margaret Levy's famous path-setting work, what we witnessed this past summer and in the United States with COVID vaccine regulation is very much relevant to the broadest theories of regulation and governance that we have. We also have another model of vaccine hesitancy. Again, this was used by Koen Verhulst. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing his name, and also used by a previous TiGRE speaker. And the idea would be that the set of things on the top would lead to individual decision-making about vaccination. Knowledge and information, past experiences, perceived importance of vaccination, risk perception and trust, things like that. Notice that the Dubé model doesn't really have a real clear role for regulatory confidence or institutions. And I would argue that coming out of some of the talks that we've seen in this series and what we've seen with the FDA, that we need a new kind of regulatory inflected model of vaccine hesitancy to think about in the future. But can we have these frameworks speak to one another? I mean, the kind of legitimacy that we care about here is actually quite specific. It's not, well, just can the government be trusted, but can a technology or an object or a commodity that has been given the imprimatur of the government be trusted, right? More so than Dubé's work, the work of Levy and Verhulst suggests that institutions are critical here. But I want to argue that institutions isn't the whole ball game. Institutions are, in this respect, performed by people, especially organizations. I would argue that what you really saw in late summer, early fall 2020 was not so much an abiding distrust of the FDA generally, although there's some of that, but a particular worry that this particular FDA would cave to this particular president. In other words, that the FDA would not engage in a truly independent evaluation of the therapy. And so I want to suggest that we should focus on regulators and their reputations as one way of linking to the larger discourse on legitimacy and trust and governance. And here again, with thanks to Professor Levy-4 and his great team at the Hebrew University and the group, the network of TiGRE, this is an important paper that I'm very thankful and pleased that Regulation and Governance produced with my co-author Justin Grimmer at Stanford and Eric Lomozoff, he's now at Villanova University, where we put out a model of why, if an approval regulation institution, which I'm going to describe shortly, was designed credibly, it would actually lead to a form of endogenous consumer confidence, okay? So I refer you to that paper. I'm not going to read the abstract. What the paper did is it used this particular model, which was a Bayesian game between a firm and a regulator, where the firm knows more, but not perfectly, about its product. The regulator knows less and basically has to look at experimental histories and can approve or reject the firm's submission. Think about Pfizer submitting a vaccine. And essentially what happens here is that the regulator wants to induce the firm to experiment. Why? Because that will give the regulator further confidence, and I would argue that will give society confidence, because society will observe some of those experiments about the eventual efficacy or safety of the product. Of course, the firm, because experimentation is costly, costs hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, to run these clinical trials, would rather not experiment, would rather submit right away. But the regulator basically adopts a strategy which induces the firm to experiment. And then what we showed is then we slapped basically a model of optimal consumption under uncertainty on that. And what we said is, compared to a world where there was no regulation, where basically where the regulator in this game would just accept the firm's submission without trying to induce any kind of experimentation, consumers in a formal model were more willing to abandon inferior products, and that means actually abandoning no treatment at all, for an unknown product, because they felt that basically the priors, their belief priors on a new product were tighter. They were more kind of compact, given the evidence that had been produced through the regulatory process, namely all those clinical trials. And this was the proposition 4. I'm not going to walk you through the math here. Again, you can check it out. But basically, the argument is that risk-neutral consumers would be more willing under an approval regulation in the presence of an FDA to adopt an uncertain product. And so what I want to argue is that credible regulation affects rational utilization adherence. They actually wouldn't necessarily, consumers, jump for bad products, or at least they wouldn't stick to them. The key in that model is that credible regulation affects rational utilization and adherence. So now let's reinterpret what happened this past summer. Approval regulation existed, but for a moment, for many people, it became non-credible. People doubted whether those tests were really going to happen, and whether the FDA was truly, in fact, going to vet with independence, with rigor, and with procedure any COVID vaccine. Note that the FDA had not published any of its work on the COVID vaccine yet. And in fact, it hadn't been submitted, the vaccine, any vaccine, Pfizer, Moderna, or otherwise, for emergency authorization. The doubts came from Trump's pressure, the hydroxychloroquine emergency authorization, which again then was revoked, and again, the slipshod way in which convalescent plasma was authorized and oversold. But I think we can get a view here into just how much this credibility of approval regulation matters, because we know just how costly COVID is, and we know just how valuable, or not just how, but have some sense of how valuable the vaccines are. So I want to be very clear here that the problem I'm about to describe in the next few minutes needs more work, and more than I can give it here. The empirical problem is that we need to estimate the difference in aggregate user confidence between two worlds, all right, that in principle or ideally would be separated only experimentally, but are not. A pressured, less credible regulation of a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, comparing that with an independent, more credible regulation of a SARS-2 vaccine control. But again, ideally, what we would like is for everything else to be held constant. So the same products, the same product data, so that the difference would be actually only in the regulation. Now, one, again, weak quasi experiment is the fact that after November 2nd, 2020, voting was over in the United States, right? And so the electoral pressure for President Trump and his administration to put the squeeze on the FDA had waned. So it's not possible at this moment to do a prospective experiment doing this, but we have a grant application in to do a survey experiment in, and using some of those public opinion polling data that I showed you earlier, we can do some modeling. Important again to keep this in mind. The improvement in vaccine confidence that we've seen in recent months is not monotonic. It's not like people have just been getting better and better beliefs about a COVID vaccine. There was a particular dip at a particular time and then a rebound. 2/3 of the positive movement has been among Democrats, and the range of plausible values that we've seen for a shift around late September or late August, early September is 5 to 15 percentage points, which in the following exercise, I'm attributing to this lack of confidence in the FDA. But again, I would argue that we see that in these panels of Gallup and the Kaiser Family Foundation. So how would a 5 to 10 to 15 percentage point change in aggregate utilization affect public health and the economic value of a vaccine? Well, that's complicated. It depends on its marginal contribution to what the epidemiologists will call herd immunity, which I'm actually not going to model that. I'm going to model total non-susceptible population, which involves nonlinearities. But here's a standard model of an epidemic. We have 4 populations: the people who are susceptible, not yet infected or vaccinated; the people who are vaccinated, assuming vaccination actually works for the near future, as long as the model is, looking at time; people who are infected; and people who are recovered. You can be recovered in 2 ways. One is dying, unfortunately, in this model. You're no longer susceptible, vaccinated, or infected if you're dead. But the other would be recovered in the sense of building antibodies and being still alive. And the way that epidemiologists usually do this is they describe a system of ordinary differential equations in which, as you can see, these different populations, and all these populations, S, V, I, and R, if you add up those boxes, that adds up to N, the total population. So at any time, the total population can be in one of those 4 boxes. And then we describe the transitions, the arrows, with this set of differential equations. I'm not going to get into everything here, but the key here is E in the first 2 differential equations is the willingness to consume a vaccine, and P is how good the vaccine is. Is the vaccine cure at 50%, 95%, 75%? E is higher, if you will, non-hesitancy or willingness to take the vaccine, all right? So again, here's what it looks like in general. So what I'm going to do is basically incorporate another parameter, which I'm going to call theta. And it's actually, I should actually entitle it regulatory credibility. Do you believe in the credibility of the vaccine as regulated by something like the FDA? And it's a simple linear scalar addition to these first 2 differential equations that you can see there. And the other 2 differential equations, these first 2 modified differential equations describe the movement of the susceptible and vaccinated populations. Notice that theta makes a positive, so regulatory confidence makes a positive contribution to dV dt. So the trajectory of vaccination is higher, as one would expect when vaccination or when regulatory confidence is higher. And the trajectory of the susceptible population is lower when theta is higher. So theta is, think about like, how much do we believe the FDA? The other two equations are unaffected. Now, one other trick. It turns out that with population heterogeneity, imagine a population composed simply of old people and young people, but the young people basically go around more, they party more, they drink more beer, and they infect other people, and so they're bigger vectors, right? So there's an important recent paper that suggests that if the population looks a little bit like that, it turns out that the threshold for herd immunity is lower than we might otherwise think, roughly 45% as opposed to 60%. However, what if those are the very same people who are most concerned about non-regulatory vaccination or non-credible regulatory evaluation? So let's now go back to that Gallup panel. Who is most concerned about the rush timeline? Voila, the concerns about the rush timeline and safety were most pronounced not among older people, but among younger people, right? So by a 14 percentage point difference between the 18 to 44 group to the 65 and older group, those people had a concern about the rush timeline. And you can kind of see why. These are people for whom COVID is less likely to be deadly, right? But if they're concerned about safety, then they're concerned about side effects that would happen even if they were going to be healthy and not affected by COVID. And this is a very important population. This is the population that we need in an epidemic to take the vaccine, precisely because they are vectors of transmission. So now let's think about what the value of regulatory credibility is. Well, here's just one estimate for 7 months in the United States of what COVID did to the United States economy and to its health system. $16 trillion, right? One of my colleagues at Harvard, Amitabh Chambra, has argued in an opinion piece that there are estimates of an effective treatment for COVID that would rest at $60 trillion globally. So the value of a treatment, if it's effective, is in the trillions of dollars, okay? However, the treatment is only effective as its adherence rate, especially a treatment with positive externalities, where the benefit that you folks get from, the benefit that people get from my taking the vaccine is not just simply the benefit that I get, but the benefit that you get because you're less likely to get infected. So what might the value then, if we work with that previous model, what might the value of FDA credibility have been? So I go into conservative assumptions that the treatment ameliorates only 50 to 75% of the virus impact. For what it's worth, the efficacy of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines right now is at 95%. However, I'm also talking about virus impact here. What's the economic effect of the virus, things like that. So I'm just going to work with the world where the treatment, once approved, affects 50 to 75%. The value of that treatment is only enjoyed by all of us in the next year, not after that. There's no need for follow-on vaccines. That's likely false. We're probably going to need to be taking these shots for a while. And the value that we're talking about is only US related, as calculated by Cutler and Summers in their piece in JAMA. If that's true, and we work with the model I showed earlier, then the value of reducing theta from 15 percentage points of people who doubt that the FDA is going to credibly regulate or credibly approve a vaccine down to 10% is anywhere from about 700 billion to 1.3 trillion dollars. The value of reducing theta 10 percentage points, getting confidence in the FDA or anti-confidence, lack of faith in the FDA from 15 percentage points down to 5 percentage points would have a value of 1.4 trillion to $2 trillion. Now, under population heterogeneity, we get again this world that those previous estimates, by the way, are only for a world where there's population homogeneity. if we have a world of population heterogeneity, which I'm exploring in these models, well, again, there's this counterintuitive thing. The herd immunity threshold is lower because what you really want to do is then vaccinate the more mobile part of the population, which in theory you can target. However, if these are the very people who are more likely to doubt the credibility of regulation, then the value of reducing theta for them is even higher. We want these people to believe in regulation all the more. And these values can increase from anywhere from 10 to 150%. My model estimates are all over the place right now based on plausible model assumptions. In other words, we can be talking about, small changes in people's beliefs about the efficacy of the FDA adding up to $2 to $4 to $5 trillion. So there are strong assumptions of this framework. First, I'm assuming that SARS-CoV will not go away on its own, at least not quickly. If we thought that it would, then, well, the vaccine isn't that important. Second, there are reductions in expressed willingness to take the FDA-approved vaccine that we saw in those polls, and I'm going to argue that those I have to assume that those correspond monotonically to expected actual reduced vaccine uptake. In other words, had the vaccine been approved in August, there would have been 10 percentage points of people who would not have taken it at that time, or 15 percentage points, consistent with those surveys. The surveys are not cheap talk. However, if these values can be taken literally, then we're seeing benefits of regulation that we normally don't see, right? In, again, the trillions of dollars. And in the regulatory impact analysis as prescribed by WIRA and as undertaken in just about every federal agency in the United States and many state agencies, quantitative estimates of the benefits of regulation would not include these kinds of calculations. Only the quantified safety benefits would normally be calculated, not what I would call the quantified confidence benefits. So let me stop there and say that I hope that what we've observed here is something of a window into the way that regulatory confidence undergirds our systems in the United States and worldwide. And it's the kind of confidence you only really detect once it vanishes for a moment in a crisis. And the crisis at some level is revelatory of wider dynamics. And I want to argue that in this case, what we're seeing is a drop-off in confidence in a product whose global economic and social value is pretty massive. I'm explicitly embracing at some level the quantification of regulatory benefits literature here, even though I might have some doubts about some of those exercises sometimes. But I'm saying that that quantification of regulatory benefits misses this confidence effect, and that we saw this confidence effect, I would argue, at work when Trump was weighing in on the FDA. But the final thing I would say is, at some level, for the FDA and any number of other regulators, these dynamics are at work all the time, right? If we really felt in the midst of a campaign that there was an amazing new treatment for cancer, and 4 years from now, President Joe Biden was up for re-election and pushed the FDA based on very weak data to approve a treatment for Alzheimer's or for cancer, do we not think that some of the same aspects of sort of declining confidence and declining utilization based on that confidence would ensue? I can give you other examples. I think they would. And that would also affect not just whether people would take up the product, it would affect revenues for the product, it would affect investment upstream for the product, it would affect the entire pharmaceutical ecosystem. And then it's, I think, worth asking whether other forms of safety and product regulation in our world are shaped by the same kinds of confidence dynamics. So I'll stop there. Sorry I went on for about another 10 minutes, but I welcome questions. I'm just going to step away to turn off my heater.
Oh, okay, I have to activate my micro. Thank you very much. Fantastic, I think very inspiring. I'm there to take your questions, so you can raise your hand in a way or another, or write in the chat. I try to keep up and follow the conversation the best I can. Um, so I, yeah, okay. I see Jonathan.
Okay, thank you, Martino. Thanks, Dan. It's a fascinating paper. So I have a question which actually links to the paper that we presented yesterday on pesticides regulation. So when you model the rational response to drug authorization, one element you don't consider is the possible effects of post-authorization monitoring and review.
Right.
And in your book on reputation and power, you argue that at least from the point of view of the FDA as a regulator, the possibility of withdrawing a product after pharmacovigilance, post-authorization, monitoring and review is seen as damaging to the reputation and credibility of the regulator. Now, in the survey experiments that we presented yesterday, which were about European pesticides regulation, we presented respondents first in a conjoint experiment with different packages of proposed reforms to pesticide regulation. We asked, which ones they would support. And the thing that they supported most strongly was post-authorization monitoring and review, and the possibility of withdrawing products that were shown to have harmful effects. You can think of it as spreading the risks of the decision out over time. And we also found in the second experiment that made them more willing to accept the regulatory authorization decision, even if it went against their prior views, like whether glyphosate should be used or not. Now, I see no reason to think that for drug authorization in general, this might not be true. With a vaccine where the immediate possible harmful effects could be large, it might not, I can't really say how that would work out, but it seems to be something which is potentially missing from your model, at least of drug authorization, even if it might not perfectly apply to the vaccine case.
Excellent point, Jonathan. I think there's probably follow-on work that needs to be done here. Some of you will know both from my book and then earlier work with Professor Mike Ting that I did a formal model of approval regulation. I don't think anybody has done a model of post authorization monitoring that I know of. Now, again, I haven't followed the literature quite as closely as I used to, that would allow people to think about those incentives and to think about the way they interact here. I agree that the vaccine case is particular in several ways. The vaccine is constantly going to be rolled out and rolling out and things like that, in part also because so many people are going to use it. The data on, the thing with vaccines, of course, everybody takes them, right? I mean, not everybody, but so many people take them. So you're less worried about, oh, well, what we're really worried about is a pure selection effect where the people who are taking this drug are facing this side effect because they were sort of predisposed already to that side effect. Well, if everybody's taking the drug, then basically, you can rule out, or at least reduce the weight on that kind of selection hypothesis. But I'll have to check out, it's another reason for me to check out your papers and your experiments. I think that this is exactly the way. I think I'm going to write this up into a paper at some point, maybe more than one. And I think as we move forward, we're going to need to think very hard about post-market authorization and the way that, post-authorization surveillance, monitoring, and holding companies to their trials. It's a big problem in the FDA right now, where companies make promises to the FDA where they'll say, "All right, yeah, we'll do a few years of trials with this after approval," and the FDA has kind of lost its hammer, and it's kind of a classic commitment problem. And given how much money these companies are making, and how important it is to have efficacy and safety in the long run, I think it's very important that we have some kind of system for making sure those trials stick. So yeah, just complete agreement with your point that the framework that I presented here doesn't have that, and as we all develop these kinds of frameworks further, they should. Excuse me.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would have a quite basic question myself, and it's about so it's a bit simplistic, but it's about the extent to which some of the distinctive features of the regulator in charge, so in this case the FDA, affect in one sense or in another this phenomenon of regulatory non-credibility, in the sense that it could go in one direction, so positively affect credibility, but also in the other sense, it could magnify, in a way, intervene as a magnifying variable, so to say, an intervening variable with a magnifying effect, because the FDA is so prominent and is so visible in the regulatory regime, while like if we think about the Swiss regulator in Swissmedic, it's perceived as highly technical, certainly less prominent in the regulatory regime for certain categories of actors, those that are probably more concerned with the vaccine. So I'm wondering whether we can introduce a source of variation at this level.
That's an excellent point, Martino. I mean, once we start thinking about, reputations and the way they affect confidence, we realize that they flow across borders. And so, I talked about this to some degree in my book, Reputation and Power, but it was really about the way that FDA procedures and institutions were adopted and sometimes resisted by other governments, such as, for instance, the regulation of Ayurvedic medicines by India's government. They adopted a lot of the FDA's procedures. But you're right that at some level, whether or not they know it, patients in Europe, citizens in Europe might be responding to the credibility of the FDA, right? And then I think it even gets, so that's another thing to think about, is to what degree do people think that, they out there, which could be the FDA, could be the EMA, could be another, have properly vetted this vaccine or this drug or this product. And how those very vague reputations, still forceful, nonetheless kind of rely a lot on that kind of weak or fuzzy causal chain. Like, who exactly was it that vetted this, and who exactly was that tested it, and how? Of course, the other really interesting thing, of course, with the EMA being, a regional regulator, no particular European head of state, no single European head of state could have put pressure on the EMA as Trump did with the FDA, right? So maybe we have a interesting case of institutional I don't want to say design, but structure there that I don't want to say it's necessarily better or worse, but it does have different reputational dynamics. Now, of course, any head of state could just say, well, I'm authorizing this for distribution within France or within Israel or within Switzerland, screw the, and get into some big debate with Brussels, or I guess now it's Amsterdam, right? It's was where the EMA is. So, but the bottom line is, I think the differing institutional structures there are kind of interesting for the way that political pressure can be applied on the agency and its authorization processes.
Thank you. Sarah, I think you have a question.
Hi, thanks very much. It's a sort of question or comment that follows on from the discussion that you've just had. I'm based in Manchester in the UK, and our vaccines regulator, the MHRA, initially approved vaccines to be used in 2 doses that were 3 weeks apart. And soon after they did that, there was quite a lot of pressure on them to extend that gap to 12 weeks. And that pressure came from a variety of people, including Tony Blair, who popped up again, almost out of nowhere. Now Brexit's over. But also the government's own vaccines committee looked into this, and they overruled that authorization so that we now have a 12-week gap between vaccine doses for individuals. And at the time that there was the debate about whether that should be extended, I thought there was a real potential crisis of credibility and reputation for the MHRA, and a potential undermining of their authority if that was overruled. But actually it seems to have worked out quite well for them, in that they appear to have been quite responsive and agile. But I also did wonder whether, because the pressure came from what has become quite an authoritative group of scientists, and we've got this phrase all the time, we're led by the science, that the source of the pressure actually helped the regulator to overcome that potential crisis.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Sarah. You're reminding me of 2 things. The first is that everything, the way I've approached reputation in this particular talk is a much more simplified and stripped down version of the way I approach it in my book, which, as many of you know, that reputations exist among multiple audiences, and that there are different facets of the regulator. This goes back to Irving Goffman's, critical work on kind of, multiple identities, multiple faces of identity. And so this question about, so it's not important in what I presented today that the FDA appear compassionate, right? It's not important that the FDA appear flexible. What matters for the calculations I gave you is that the FDA appear rigorous and credible, right? In other words, that the bad cop aspect of the reputation is kind of more important than the good cop aspect. But as we know, there's going to be pressure to do exactly the kind of things that you just discussed for a range of people, right? It's not just on the basis of, okay, who's first to approve, but can we get these things out there now? Now that people begin to believe that the vaccine works, now everybody's going to want it, and people are going to want to stretch the rules. And of course, we've had a similar debate here about, just how many doses can you squeeze out of those vials that Pfizer and Moderna are shipping around. And the FDA is quite fairly saying, and I suspect folks I'm sorry, forgetting the acronym that you used for the British agency. They're rightly saying, well, look, the clinical trial evidence was all based on a kind of a set regimen that we had, and we had to standardize that regimen. Otherwise, you're losing a lot of statistical power, right, and ability to make inferences from the data if we allow that to vary all over the place, right? Which goes into the question of, like, again, when the FDA approves these things, or when a regulator approves these things, they're not just proving a binary thing, they're proving a bundle. They're approving the chemical or the biochemical. They're approving its label. they're approving a regimen of administration that goes along with the label. They're approving just this whole bundle of things that kind of everybody has to have confidence in, right? And so part of what you're pointing there is something I think probably that all needs more work as we think about, vaccination and other forms of regulation, is the tension between the legitimacy that one gives to the product itself and then the flexibility that people might demand once the product is legitimated in terms of its consumption, utilization, application, and the real tension that emerges there.
Thank you. I think since we started a little bit later than anticipated, we still have I don't know, 4 or 5 minutes for questions or comments, if any. I see that a few people had to leave because yes. Oh, okay. Eva is actually raising her hand, so please.
Sorry, it's just sort of a follow-up on the discussion we've had, not so much a question. Thanks so much for the interesting talk. But yeah, just sort of the point that Martino made, FDA, of course, and then you know it much better than anyone else, is specific even in the US context, and then it's much better known to the American public than pharma regulators usually are in European countries to their but now they. So I think this is interesting for all of us interested in these regulators and reputation and how it matters, because becoming more well known because of COVID in a way. So I think it's interesting to keep a tab on that in Europe. And just I think an additional point when it comes to the UK dynamic that Sarah mentioned is that basically over the last week or so, French government official or people elected to the highest office, really German politicians as well, have publicly said that what the British regulators are doing is unsafe. And of course, that's reported in the media here. So just to say, I think this is really interesting now for studying the dynamics within Europe, which I think will be quite different to US dynamics, which don't undermine at all the argument about the importance of reputation. But yeah, just to sort of give us all a reason to keep on following this in the European context as well, because I think it gives very different dynamics to the US context, because the reputation traveling across borders is amplified at the moment, I think.
That's an excellent point. I mean, you think just the way that there's been all these, cross-national comparisons throughout COVID, right? Like, okay, Germany's doing better than France. Everybody's doing better than the United States. New Zealand's doing better than everybody, and it's not just because they're an island, that kind of thing. And then of course, and Jonathan put in the chat this pressure on the EMA. I mean, there was this early kind of like, chest bumping or chest thumping, I should say, between the UK and the US about who was going to be quickest to approve the vaccine and things like that. All of which is really meaningless, given that we're talking about 2 or 3 weeks, and the biggest barriers, as we're seeing right now, are not regulatory approval, but administration. Right? It depends far more on the public health infrastructure of a country. So I think this is something we're going to see play out, Eva. We're going to see these regulators kind of engaged in a little bit of a reputational competition with one another, and how much that drives them versus the need to also be aware of kind of populist movements in their countries. They're trying to hold them accountable, I think is an open question, but I think it's going to be an important one.
All right. Thank you very much. So I think that now we are near to the end, or at the end actually, of this extremely insightful presentation and discussion. So and so relevant these days, of course, and it will be for a period apparently. So many thanks, Dan. Thank you very much to everyone, and see you next time. Stay tuned to the TiGRE webinars.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Stay safe.